Her final days in a frontier cabin. What the rancher did shocked the town. The frontier town of Willow Creek lay quiet under the early morning sun. Dust rose in small clouds along the dirt streets as the few townspeople went about their daily chores. Life here was hard, harsh, and unforgiving, but it had its own rhythm, a rhythm that those who had lived here for years had learned to respect. Among the wooden cabins and scattered ranches, whispers often traveled faster than the wind. Everyone knew everyone's business, or at least they thought they did. On this particular morning, the rhythm of the town shifted slightly, though no one knew why. At the edge of town, on a narrow trail that led toward the untamed plains, a lone figure appeared. She was small and frail, her steps careful and deliberate as she made her way along the rough path. Her name was Margaret, a woman whose life had been full of hardship and sorrow, though the townspeople would not yet know the details. She carried only a worn leather satchel and a thin bundle wrapped in a faded cloth, enough to sustain her for the journey to the cabin she had chosen. Margaret's eyes were tired, shadowed by the weight of years, yet they held a spark of determination. She had made a decision, one she knew would not be understood by anyone who had not lived her life. She wanted to spend her final days in solitude, far from the prying eyes of the town and the noise of the world. The cabin she had chosen was old and abandoned, set slightly apart from the rest of Willow Creek. Its wood was weathered, its roof sagging, but it offered shelter and, more importantly, privacy. As she approached the cabin, Margaret paused to catch her breath. She looked around at the wide, open plains that stretched beyond the tree line. The wind carried the faint scent of wildflowers and dry earth. It was peaceful here, yet lonely in a way that matched the quiet ache she carried within her. She had lived many years with little companionship, and though she had experienced joy and sorrow alike, the memories of her losses were heavy upon her. Here, she hoped to find some semblance of peace. Meanwhile, in the town, Thomas, a rancher known for his strong frame and quiet demeanor, had noticed the newcomer from the moment she appeared on the trail. He had lived in Willow Creek for most of his life, working the land, tending to his cattle, and keeping to himself in his modest ranch house. Thomas was a man of action rather than words, known for helping those in need when necessary, but also for keeping a respectful distance from others' affairs. He had a keen sense for observing people, understanding without being told, and he could sense that Margaret was someone different from the usual travelers who passed through town. From the porch of his ranch house, Thomas watched her approach the cabin. He noticed her careful steps, the way she carried herself despite obvious weakness, and the determination in her gaze. Something about her drew his attention, though he could not yet say why. He felt a quiet concern stir within him, a sense that she might need help, though he was unsure if she would accept it. In Willow Creek, people often kept to themselves, and pride ran as strong as the rivers in the spring. But Thomas was patient. He decided to wait, to observe, and to act only if it became necessary. Margaret reached the cabin and paused at the creaking wooden door. She hesitated before entering, her hand lingering on the cold latch. The cabin smelled of old wood and dust, the scent of abandonment and time. Inside, the floorboards groaned under her careful steps, and the walls seemed to close around her with silence. She set down her bundle and sat on the edge of a creaking chair, letting herself breathe for the first time in what felt like hours. The sun streamed through the small, grimy windows, casting lines of light across the worn floor. The cabin was far from comfortable, but it would serve its purpose. As she unpacked her few belongings, Margaret allowed herself to feel the weight of her loneliness. There were no sounds here except the wind outside and the occasional caw of a crow in the distance. She had lived many years in towns and cities, surrounded by people, yet she had always felt unseen, unnoticed. Here, she would be free from expectation and judgment. She could rest without pretending, without hiding the pain she had carried for decades. Back in town, Thomas continued to watch from a distance. He did not approach immediately, respecting her space, yet he could not shake the feeling that the woman was vulnerable. The frontier was unforgiving, and even a simple illness or accident could prove disastrous in a place so isolated. Thomas knew the importance of community, even if many chose to live in solitude. Something inside him urged him to step forward, but he also knew he must tread carefully. Too much interference could scare her away or make her defensive. The townspeople, on the other hand, began to notice the arrival of the stranger. From the general store to the blacksmith's forge, whispers spread. Who is she? Some asked. Why is she out there all alone? Others wondered. Margaret's decision to live in isolation sparked curiosity and, in some cases, judgment. People feared what they did not understand. They speculated about her past, imagining reasons for her retreat from society. Some believed she was wealthy and seeking solitude, others thought she might have run from trouble or scandal. No one knew for certain, and that uncertainty made her presence all the more intriguing. Margaret, aware that she was being watched, felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She did not wish to draw attention, but she also knew that living entirely alone carried risks. She set about making the cabin as comfortable as possible, sweeping the floor, stacking firewood, and preparing a small space for herself to rest. Each action was deliberate, a way to create a sense of order and peace in the midst of uncertainty. As evening approached, the wind picked up, rustling through the tall grass outside. Margaret lit a small lantern, the warm glow filling the cabin with a gentle light. She sat by the window, looking out over the plains, feeling the solitude that had brought her here. Yet beneath the surface of that solitude, there was a quiet hope, a hope that someone, if they were kind enough, might offer companionship or help in her final days. She did not expect much, but the thought lingered in her heart. Thomas, meanwhile, made a decision. He would approach, but slowly, carefully, offering help without imposing. He prepared a small basket with fresh bread and dried meat, simple food that could sustain her. As he walked toward the cabin along the winding path, he thought about the lessons of the frontier. That kindness often mattered more than pride, and that no one should face hardship entirely alone. He hoped she would accept his help, though he knew it might take time. When Thomas reached the edge of the clearing, he stopped, giving Margaret space to notice him first. She saw the figure standing there, calm and respectful, holding the basket. Her heart tightened, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar feeling of being considered, of someone offering care without expectation or judgment. She hesitated, unsure if she should speak or retreat into the shadows of the cabin. Thomas simply nodded and said in a gentle voice, "I brought some food, thought you might like some company even if just for a moment." There was no pressure, no demand, only an invitation. Margaret studied him, noting the strength in his posture and the kindness in his eyes. Slowly she nodded, accepting the basket. It was a small gesture, but it carried weight. It was the first connection she had made with another human being in a long time, a bridge between her solitude and the world outside. As she took the food and thanked him quietly, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and pink. The frontier seemed vast, endless, yet in that small clearing, Margaret felt a sense of possibility. Perhaps her final days would not be entirely lonely. Perhaps there was someone who could understand her without intrusion, someone who could walk beside her through the quiet and the storms. That night, as the wind whispered through the plains and the stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, Margaret sat by the fire with Thomas's gift beside her. The cabin, once silent and empty, now carried a sense of warmth. Outside, the town slept, unaware of the quiet beginning of a story that would soon shock and move them all. Inside the cabin, a fragile woman and a careful rancher had taken the first steps toward an unexpected companionship, one built on respect, kindness, and the simple humanity that the frontier often demanded. The morning sun broke over the plains, spilling warm light across the small frontier cabin where Margaret had spent her first night. The wind carried the faint scent of sagebrush and dry earth, the same wind that had swept across the wide open fields for generations. Margaret stirred from her thin blanket, her body stiff and sore from the long journey and the challenges of living alone. She had faced hardship before, but the isolation of the cabin made each movement feel heavier, each breath a little more deliberate. Yet she felt a strange sense of calm, a feeling she had not known for years. The previous evening, when Thomas had offered her food, had reminded her that kindness still existed in the world. Margaret rose slowly, moving to the small, grimy window to look out at the town below. Willow Creek lay quiet, the few early risers tending to animals and chores, their figures small against the vast plains. She knew that to most she was a mystery. They did not know her story, and she preferred it that way. There was comfort in the unknown, in the ability to keep one's life private, especially at the end of it. But Margaret also understood that living entirely alone had its risks. Illness could strike, Accidents could happen, and there would be no one to notice or help. She had chosen isolation for peace, yet she realized that even peace sometimes required connection. After a simple breakfast of bread and dried fruit, Margaret stepped outside, feeling the sun on her face. The cabin yard was small, surrounded by tall grass and the remains of an old fence that had long since begun to decay. She moved carefully, sweeping the porch with a worn broom and tidying the small area around the cabin. Each action was slow, deliberate, a way to create order in a space that had been abandoned for years. As she worked, she thought about Thomas and his unexpected gesture of kindness. It had been a small act, just a basket of food, but it carried something far greater: attention, care, and respect. Meanwhile, Thomas prepared for another trip to the cabin. He had spent the night thinking about Margaret, about her vulnerability and her determination to remain independent. He respected her choice to live alone, but he could not ignore the thought that she might need help, even if she did not realize it yet. He packed a few more supplies, a bit of fresh bread, a jar of honey, and some warm blankets, and set out across the trail that led to her cabin. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of smoke from the chimneys of the town. Birds chirped in the distance, and the sound of hooves on dirt echoed faintly from nearby ranches. As he approached the cabin, Thomas slowed his pace, careful not to startle Margaret. He could see her outside, moving among the porch and the small yard, her hands steady despite the obvious effort each movement required. He watched her for a moment, noting the way she moved, the quiet dignity in her actions, and the small hints of fatigue that lingered in her posture. He wanted to help, but he knew that trust would need to grow naturally. It could not be forced. "Good morning," he called gently as he stepped into the yard, his voice steady but friendly. Margaret turned, a slight startle in her expression, but it quickly softened into recognition. She smiled faintly, nodding in greeting. "Good morning," she replied, her voice soft but clear. "I didn't expect anyone so early." "I thought I'd bring a few things," Thomas said, holding out the basket. "Just some food and blankets, nothing more." His tone carried respect, a quiet acknowledgement of her independence. Margaret studied him for a moment, then accepted the basket, feeling the warmth of human consideration once again. They spent the morning together, though not in constant conversation. Margaret worked on tidying the cabin while Thomas assisted without overstepping, carrying firewood, stacking it neatly near the door, and checking the small garden that had been left untended for years. Margaret felt a mixture of gratitude and caution. She was not used to relying on anyone, but Thomas's presence was reassuring rather than intrusive. There was no pressure, no demand, only a willingness to help. By midday, the two shared a simple meal outside on the porch. The sun was warm, the breeze gentle, and the world beyond the cabin seemed distant. Margaret spoke quietly of her life, revealing fragments of her story, places she had lived, the challenges she had faced, and the loneliness that had often accompanied her. Thomas listened, never interrupting, offering only occasional observations and questions that showed he was paying attention without prying. As the day wore on, Thomas helped Margaret with tasks that had become too difficult for her alone. He repaired the small roof over the porch, patched a few holes in the walls, and cleared the overgrown path leading from the cabin to the nearby creek. Each task was done with care, a quiet demonstration of his commitment to her well-being. Margaret watched him work, feeling a warmth in her chest that she had not experienced in many years. She realized that she had been starved not for food, but for connection, for the presence of someone who understood the balance between assistance and respect. The townspeople began to notice the growing interaction between Margaret and Thomas. At the general store, whispers spread. "Have you seen the rancher with the woman at the cabin? I wonder what she's like," others speculated. The gossip was harmless, though persistent, and it highlighted the unusual nature of their bond. Thomas was known as a quiet, independent man, not one to involve himself in the affairs of others unnecessarily. That he spent time helping Margaret caught the town's attention, though no one yet understood the depth of the connection forming in the small cabin at the edge of Willow Creek. Margaret spent the afternoon resting, her body fatigued from the morning's activity. Thomas, seeing her need for rest, moved quietly to prepare a small fire in the hearth. He tended to it carefully, ensuring the cabin would remain warm as the evening approached. The glow of the fire cast soft shadows across the walls, creating a sense of comfort and security. Margaret watched him, realizing that she felt safer than she had in years. The frontier was still harsh, but for the first time she felt a measure of protection that did not come from walls or locks, but from human kindness. As evening fell, the two settled into a quiet routine. Margaret prepared a simple supper, while Thomas assisted by fetching water and tending the fire. Their conversation was gentle, filled with stories of life on the frontier, the struggles of survival, and the small joys that could be found in unexpected places. Margaret spoke of the loneliness she had endured, and Thomas shared memories of his life on the ranch, of the people he had known, and of the lessons he had learned about community, trust, and the importance of helping others. By the time darkness fell, the cabin was filled with a quiet warmth. The lantern cast a soft light across the room, and the wind outside whispered through the grass and trees. Margaret felt a sense of calm, a feeling that perhaps she was not as alone as she had feared. She realized that the bond forming with Thomas was more than simple friendship. It was the foundation of trust, built slowly, carefully, over shared effort and respect. That night, as Margaret settled under her thin blanket, she thought about the day and the man who had brought warmth, food, and company into her life. She knew that her time was limited, that the frontier could be unforgiving, but she also understood that even in her final days, she could experience care, compassion, and dignity. Thomas, meanwhile, returned to his ranch, thinking of the frail woman who had captured his concern. He respected her independence, but he knew he would continue to help her, step by step, day by day. The day had begun with the quiet stillness of isolation and ended with the first spark of connection. Margaret's journey had begun, not with grand gestures or dramatic events, but with the simple acts of listening, observing, and helping. The frontier remained a place of hardship and beauty, of loneliness and community, and in that small cabin, the possibilities of trust and companionship had begun to take root. Margaret closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the fire and the memory of the day soothe her. She felt a cautious hope, a belief that even in solitude one could find connection. Outside, the plains stretched endlessly under the stars, a reminder of the vast world she had chosen to face alone. Inside, the cabin was no longer empty. It held the promise of human kindness, of a quiet companionship that could make even the hardest days bearable. And so, in the stillness of the evening, with the frontier night wrapping around the cabin, Margaret and Thomas took the first steps toward a bond that would shape her remaining days. It was a bond built on respect, patience, and the gentle understanding that even the strongest and most independent among us sometimes need someone to care. In the quiet of the cabin, with the plains stretching endlessly beyond, hope began to grow, fragile but real, promising that the coming days might hold warmth, comfort, and a measure of peace in the final chapter of Margaret's life. The days that followed were marked by quiet, routine, and subtle changes. Margaret woke each morning with the same cautious hope, and Thomas continued to visit her cabin regularly, carrying supplies, food, and, most importantly, his gentle presence. The bond between them had grown naturally, without haste or expectation, like the steady flow of the nearby creek that whispered through the plains. The townspeople still whispered among themselves about the frail woman and the strong rancher who spent so much time together, but they had little understanding of the depth of the connection that was forming. One morning, Margaret did not rise immediately as the sunlight touched the cabin floor. Thomas arrived, carrying his usual basket of bread, honey, and blankets, only to find the cabin unusually quiet. He called softly, "Margaret, are you awake?" There was no answer. Concern tightened in his chest as he stepped inside. He found her sitting in her chair, slumped slightly, her face pale and her eyes tired. The effort it took for her to lift her head showed him immediately that something was wrong. "Good morning," he said gently, kneeling beside her. "You don't look well. Are you feeling sick?" Margaret managed a small shake of her head and a faint smile, trying to hide the discomfort. But Thomas could see through the attempt. He had spent enough time observing her to know the signs of weakness. The harsh frontier life had taken its toll, and though she had survived decades of hardship, the isolation had begun to weigh heavily on her body. Thomas set the basket down and helped her settle more comfortably in her chair. He prepared a small bowl of warm water and guided her to sip slowly, reminding her to take her time. Margaret followed his instructions, feeling a strange mix of vulnerability and relief. She was not used to depending on anyone, yet the calm assurance in Thomas's actions made her trust him completely. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to rely on someone else, even in this small way. Over the next few days, Margaret's condition worsened slightly. She felt weak, her body demanding more rest than usual. Thomas stayed close, tending to her needs, chopping firewood, fetching water, and ensuring that the cabin remained safe and warm. He adjusted his routine to be present during the times she needed him most, but always with care to respect her independence. She could have refused his help, but each time she found herself grateful for it, recognizing that his presence did not diminish her autonomy. It enhanced her comfort and security. Margaret shared more of her story during this time. She spoke of her early years, growing up in towns that were not as kind or forgiving as Willow Creek. She spoke of losses, friends, family, and the quiet pain of life passing too quickly. Thomas listened without judgment, his expressions quiet and attentive. Sometimes he asked questions, gentle inquiries meant only to show interest and understanding. Margaret's voice was often soft, almost hesitant, but the sharing itself became a kind of relief, a release of burdens she had carried alone for decades. The bond between them deepened naturally through shared tasks and quiet companionship. Thomas repaired small parts of the cabin that had fallen into disrepair, fixed the creaking roof, and patched broken window panes to protect against the changing weather. He prepared meals that were simple but nourishing, and he reminded Margaret to rest whenever her strength faltered. Each act, small as it seemed, became a thread weaving trust and care between them. One particularly harsh afternoon, a storm swept across the plains. The wind rattled the cabin windows, and rain pelted the wooden roof in heavy sheets. Margaret, already weak from illness, struggled to keep the fire burning and the cabin warm. Thomas arrived just as the storm reached its peak, carrying extra blankets and kindling. He stepped inside, closing the door against the wind, and immediately set to work tending the fire. The cabin, once cold and unwelcoming, was filled with warmth and light again, not just from the flames, but from the reassurance of care. Margaret watched him move with quiet admiration. His calm confidence, his careful attention, and his refusal to speak more than necessary all spoke louder than words ever could. In the midst of the storm, she realized that she no longer felt alone. The frontier, with all its challenges and harshness, had provided her a companion, not in the form of a friend from the town, nor a family member from her distant past, but in someone who understood the balance between assistance and respect, someone who could share the burden. Without taking control. As the storm subsided, Thomas helped Margaret to her bed, ensuring she was comfortable and warm. He checked that the blankets were tucked securely around her and that the small lantern on the bedside table was lit, casting a gentle glow. Margaret looked at him, feeling a surge of gratitude. She had not expected to find such care in her final days, yet here it was, quietly given without expectation or judgment. Over the following week, Thomas's care became even more deliberate. He brought fresh water from the creek each morning, carried additional firewood to ensure warmth, and prepared simple meals to keep Margaret nourished. She began to rely on him not out of weakness, but out of recognition that his presence allowed her to conserve energy for the moments that mattered most. She could focus on her thoughts, her memories, and the small joys of life without the constant worry of survival. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Margaret spoke to Thomas about her fears. "I have lived a long life," she said softly, "and I know the end is near. But I am afraid of being alone when it comes." Thomas listened quietly, sitting beside her with a calm presence that offered comfort without intrusion. "You won't be alone," he said gently. "I will be here as long as you need me." Margaret felt a warmth in her chest that she had not felt in decades, a sense of peace and reassurance that was rare and precious in the harsh frontier. Thomas continued to visit regularly, his efforts steady and consistent. He repaired broken furniture, tended to the small garden outside the cabin, and kept the fire going even during the coldest nights. Margaret began to look forward to his visits, not just for the practical help he provided, but for the quiet companionship that had become a lifeline in her solitude. She shared small stories, memories of people she had known, and even small hopes and dreams she had once held. Thomas listened without judgment, offering gentle encouragement when appropriate, and simply sharing the space when she needed quiet. The townspeople, meanwhile, noticed the changes in the relationship. At the general store, whispers began anew. The rancher spends so much time at the cabin now. I heard he helps her even when the weather is bad. Some were skeptical, others curious, but all were aware that something unusual was unfolding. What they did not understand was the depth of trust and care that had developed between the two. It was not about gossip or spectacle. It was about two people finding connection in the most unlikely of circumstances. Margaret's health, while fragile, seemed bolstered by the presence of Thomas. Each day she grew a little stronger, her spirits lifted by the knowledge that someone was there who truly cared. The cabin, once a place of loneliness, became a space of warmth, safety, and dignity. Margaret realized that her final days would not be defined solely by isolation and struggle, but by the gentle humanity of a man who had chosen to care without question. One afternoon, as the wind stirred the tall grass outside and the distant mountains glowed in the sunlight, Margaret turned to Thomas. "You have done so much for me," she said quietly. "I do not know how to thank you." Thomas smiled softly, brushing a hand over the stack of firewood. "No thanks are necessary," he replied. "I only do what anyone would do if they could. It matters little who receives the help, as long as it is given." Margaret felt a wave of gratitude and something more, a sense of connection that she had not experienced in years. The stormy nights, the quiet mornings, and the long afternoons together had created a bond neither could have predicted. Margaret had come to the frontier seeking solitude, yet she found companionship and care that allowed her to face the end of her life with dignity. Thomas, in turn, found a purpose that went beyond tending his ranch or observing the town. He became a guardian of comfort and peace, quietly ensuring that Margaret's final days were marked by warmth, kindness, and human connection. As the week drew to a close, Margaret's health began to show signs of decline, but she faced each day with a calmness rooted in trust. She no longer feared the coming days because she knew that Thomas would be there. The cabin, once a symbol of isolation, had transformed into a haven of quiet support. And Thomas, strong and steady, continued to provide care not for recognition, but because it was simply the right thing to do. That evening, as the stars appeared one by one in the vast frontier sky, Margaret sat by the small fire, feeling the warmth on her face. Thomas adjusted the blankets around her shoulders, his presence a silent promise that she would not be alone. In that small cabin at the edge of the plains, a fragile woman and a quiet rancher had discovered a connection that transcended the hardships of life. It was not marked by grand gestures or loud declarations, but by the simple acts of presence, care, and respect. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the comfort of the fire and the gentle assurance of Thomas's watchful care. For the first time in many years, she could rest without fear, knowing that even in her final days, she was not alone. Outside, the frontier stretched endlessly, wild and untamed, yet inside the cabin, there was warmth, companionship, and the quiet strength of human kindness. And so, in the soft glow of the firelight, with the plains stretching into the night, Margaret and Thomas continued their journey together. It was a journey of trust, compassion, and the profound understanding that even in the harshest of places, humanity could create moments of peace, connection, and hope, moments that could shape the final chapters of a life in ways neither had expected. The days grew shorter, and the wind across the plains carried the crisp chill of approaching winter. Margaret's condition, already fragile, began to show clearer signs of decline. She struggled more with simple tasks, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to carry water or chop firewood. Even the smallest movements left her breathless. Thomas noticed these changes immediately. Though he had expected her frailty, seeing her struggle day after day deepened his concern. The frontier was unforgiving, and he understood that time was running short. One morning, as he approached the cabin carrying his usual basket, Thomas paused at the edge of the clearing. Margaret sat on the porch, her head bowed, a thin scarf wrapped around her shoulders to fight the morning chill. Her hands rested in her lap, still and weak. She looked up at Thomas as he stepped closer, and he saw the weariness etched into every line of her face. She tried to smile, but it was faint, almost imperceptible. The sight tugged at his heart. He realized that staying on the periphery was no longer enough. She needed more than his visits, more than the small comforts he could provide from outside her world. "Good morning, Margaret," Thomas said softly, setting down the basket and kneeling beside her. "How are you feeling today?" Margaret shook her head slightly. I am tired," she admitted quietly. "Everything seems harder now, and I am afraid." Her voice broke slightly, revealing a vulnerability she had tried to hide. Thomas reached out and gently took her hand, the warmth of his touch a quiet reassurance. "You don't need to be afraid," he said. "I will make sure you are safe. You won't have to face this alone." Margaret looked at him, studying his calm expression. She had grown to trust him deeply over the past weeks, yet the thought of leaving her cabin, her carefully chosen place of solitude, filled her with hesitation. "I don't want to leave my home," she whispered. "I came here for peace, to be alone in my final days. I am afraid if I go anywhere else it will feel like losing control, losing everything I have." Thomas nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I know," he said gently. "This cabin has been your sanctuary, but you don't have to give up your independence to be safe. You can rest and be cared for without losing yourself." He paused, considering the words carefully. "Margaret, I want to offer you a place in my home just for now. You will have your space, your comfort, and dignity. I will make sure everything you need is here, but you won't have to struggle alone." Margaret remained silent for a long moment, her eyes downcast. The thought of leaving her cabin was daunting, but she also felt the undeniable truth in Thomas's words. Her body was growing weaker by the day. The winds were colder, the nights longer, and the demands of survival heavier than she could manage alone. Slowly, she nodded. If you promise I can have my space, I will come with you," she said quietly. Thomas smiled gently, his eyes warm. "You will have your space and you will be safe, I promise." He helped her to her feet with steady hands, careful not to strain her. The walk to his ranch house, though short, was deliberate, ensuring she moved at her own pace. The plains stretched around them, wide and wild, but Thomas's presence made the journey feel safe. When they arrived at his home, Margaret took in her surroundings with cautious curiosity. The ranch house was simple but sturdy, built from warm, well-maintained wood. The fire in the hearth glowed softly, casting a comforting light across the room. Thomas had prepared a small bedroom for her, with soft blankets, a chair by the window, and a small table for her personal belongings. Margaret's eyes welled slightly as she took it all in. For the first time in years, she felt a profound sense of being cared for without losing dignity. Thomas helped her settle into the room, making sure she was comfortable and had everything she needed within reach. "I'll be nearby if you need anything," he said. "But you can take your time, rest, and relax. This is your space." Margaret nodded, feeling a warmth in her chest she had not felt in decades. The frontier had been harsh, unforgiving, and lonely, but here, within these walls, she had found peace. In the days that followed, Thomas's care became more attentive. He prepared meals suited to her needs, ensuring she could eat without exertion. He brought water and fresh blankets each morning, kept the fire burning, and adjusted the room to her comfort. Margaret began to move about the house slowly, feeling the stability of furniture and walls that would not shift under her weight or creak unexpectedly. She felt safe, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to rest fully, trusting that someone was watching over her with genuine care. The townspeople began to notice the change. They had expected Margaret to remain in her isolated cabin, but now she was seen entering the ranch house with Thomas, supported but dignified. Whispers spread quickly. "I heard the rancher brought her inside. I wonder what is happening." Some were skeptical, others concerned, but none could deny the respect Thomas showed her. His actions were not boastful or dramatic. They were quiet, deliberate, and full of integrity. Margaret, meanwhile, found herself opening up in ways she had not anticipated. She shared stories of her youth, of family she had lost, and the challenges she had faced alone. Thomas listened patiently, never interrupting, offering comfort and understanding with his presence rather than words alone. They spoke of the frontier, of survival, of small joys and past hardships. Margaret realized that she was not simply surviving here. She was living, truly living, in the presence of care, respect, and human connection. One evening, as the wind swept across the plains outside, Margaret sat by the hearth, watching the flames dance across the logs. Thomas placed a cup of warm tea beside her and sat quietly in the chair opposite. She looked at him, her eyes soft with gratitude. "I never imagined my final days could be like this," she said. "I thought I would face them alone, cold and forgotten, but now I feel peace." Thomas nodded, his expression gentle. "You deserve peace," he said. "Everyone deserves kindness and comfort, especially in the times when it matters most. You have faced life with courage, and now it's time to rest with dignity." Margaret felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and quiet happiness. For the first time in years, she felt truly safe. As the days turned into weeks, Thomas's care never wavered. He adjusted to her changing needs, bringing extra blankets on colder nights, ensuring the fire never went out, and preparing meals that were nourishing and easy to digest. Margaret grew weaker, but her spirits remained steady because of the unwavering support she received. She could face each day with courage, knowing that she was not alone, that someone genuinely cared for her well-being. The bond between them became deeper than companionship. It was trust, respect, and quiet understanding. Margaret could speak of fears and regrets without judgment, and Thomas provided comfort without intruding on her autonomy. He had created a sanctuary within the walls of his home, a place where she could live her final days with dignity, warmth, and connection. The frontier, once cold and unforgiving, now held a sense of home, of care, and of profound humanity. One particularly cold evening, as snowflakes began to drift across the plains, Margaret reflected on the life she had lived. She had faced hardships, loss, and solitude, yet she had never known the quiet comfort of being truly cared for without expectation. Thomas had given her that gift, not out of obligation, but out of choice. His actions had transformed her remaining days from a time of fear and struggle into a period of warmth, reflection, and peace. Thomas, too, found meaning in his care. He had spent a lifetime working the land, tending to cattle, and living independently. Yet in tending to Margaret, he discovered a deeper purpose. It was not about recognition or reward. It was about providing humanity and dignity where it was needed most. He had given her not just comfort, but respect and trust, and in doing so, he had honored her life and choices. As the frontier night settled over the ranch, Margaret rested in her room, the fire casting soft shadows across the walls. She felt the quiet presence of Thomas nearby, ready to respond if she needed anything, but allowing her the freedom to rest and reflect. The room, once filled with the solitude of her cabin, now carried warmth, care, and the sense that she was not alone. Outside, the snow fell gently over the plains, blanketing the frontier in quiet serenity. Inside, Margaret felt safe, her spirit lifted by the kindness and patience of a man who had chosen to share his care without intrusion. For the first time in many years, she experienced a profound sense of peace, knowing that her remaining days would be filled with comfort, dignity, and quiet companionship. And so, within the walls of the ranch house, Margaret's life entered a new chapter. It was a chapter defined not by isolation, hardship, or fear, but by trust, care, and the gentle humanity of someone who understood the balance between help and respect. The frontier remained harsh and wild beyond the windows, but within there was warmth, safety, and a quiet joy that neither she nor Thomas had expected, but both had come to cherish. The days in Thomas's ranch house passed quietly, yet with a rhythm that brought comfort to both. Margaret and the quiet rancher, who had taken it upon himself to care for her. The cabin at the edge of town, once her refuge, had become a memory, replaced by a room that offered warmth, safety, and dignity. Margaret had grown weaker with each passing day, but the presence of Thomas ensured that she never felt alone. Each morning, she awoke to the soft crackle of the fire and the faint aroma of breakfast prepared with care. It was a simple routine, yet it held more meaning than anything she had known in years. Thomas moved quietly around the house, performing small tasks to keep Margaret comfortable. He refilled her water jug, checked that her blankets were tucked snugly around her shoulders, and adjusted the lantern to cast light on her reading table. Even the smallest details mattered. He remembered how she liked her tea warm but not hot, how she preferred her chair near the window so she could see the plains, and how she appreciated quiet moments more than constant conversation. He performed these acts without being asked, understanding instinctively what she needed before she had to say it. Margaret noticed the changes in herself as well. Though her body was frail and often tired, her spirit felt lighter. The constant worry and struggle of survival had faded, replaced by a sense of peace she had not experienced in decades. She could sit by the fire, look out at the endless plains, and allow herself to remember happy moments from her past without the fear of exhaustion or illness. Thomas's steady presence allowed her to focus not on what she lacked, but on the quiet joys that remained in life. One afternoon, as snow began to drift lightly across the plains, Margaret asked Thomas to sit with her by the window. She looked out at the frozen landscape, her eyes soft with reflection. "I never thought my final days would be like this," she said quietly. "I expected loneliness, fear, and cold nights by myself, but now I feel warmth, comfort, and care. I feel dignity." Thomas nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a gentle calm. "You deserve every bit of it," he said. "Everyone deserves kindness in their final days, and it is a privilege to be here with you." Margaret smiled faintly, the weight of years seeming to lift slightly in that quiet moment. It was a simple exchange, yet it carried a depth that words could not fully capture. As the days passed, Margaret's health declined steadily. She required more rest, and her movements became slower, more deliberate. Thomas adapted his care to her changing needs, ensuring that she could remain comfortable without losing her independence. He brought meals to her bedside when she could not sit at the table, adjusted the fire to maintain warmth without overwhelming her room, and offered blankets and pillows to ease her body into comfort. Margaret felt safe in a way she had never known, her vulnerability met with unwavering care rather than judgment or pity. The townspeople continued to notice the remarkable dedication of the rancher. Whispers traveled through Willow Creek. "He brought her into his home to care for her. He stays with her day and night, even in cold weather." While some expressed surprise, others were quietly inspired. They saw not a man seeking recognition, but a person performing acts of quiet heroism, acts that would leave a lasting impact on the life of someone who had been alone for so long. Margaret, though growing weaker, found her days enriched with small joys. She could watch the sun rise over the snow-covered plains, listen to the wind sweep through the trees, and feel the warmth of the fire against her hands. She shared stories from her youth, tales of places she had lived, friends she had lost, and lessons she had learned. Thomas listened attentively, never interrupting, and sometimes joined with his own stories, of the frontier, of the hardships of ranch life, and of the quiet satisfaction that came from seeing others cared for. Each story strengthened their bond, building a sense of companionship that was both comforting and profound. One particularly cold evening, Margaret asked Thomas to sit closer to her bed. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, yet inside the room was a sanctuary of warmth. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice weak but steady, "you have given me more than comfort, you have given me peace. You have shown me that even at the end, kindness and humanity still exist." Thomas took her hand gently, holding it with care. "It has been an honor," he replied. "I could not let you face these days alone." Everyone deserves dignity, comfort, and a sense of peace, especially in the final chapters of life. As the days grew shorter and the nights longer, Margaret's body grew frailer, yet her spirit remained gentle and strong. Thomas continued to provide for her needs meticulously. He kept her room warm, prepared nourishing meals, and ensured she had everything she needed to rest without worry. Even when the wind howled and the snow blanketed the plains, Margaret felt safe in a way that transcended physical comfort. It was the emotional security of being truly seen, cared for, and respected. One morning, Margaret spoke softly, her voice almost a whisper. "Thomas, I am grateful. I will not forget what you have done for me." Thomas smiled gently. "You do not need to remember me. Your comfort and peace are enough." She squeezed his hand weakly, and for a moment silence filled the room, a silence not of emptiness, but of understanding, connection, and shared humanity. As the week continued, Margaret's decline became more apparent. She could no longer walk to the window alone and needed Thomas to help her settle into her chair or bed. He adjusted to these changes without complaint, performing each task with patience and quiet attention. Margaret felt a profound sense of gratitude for his unwavering care. She realized that her final days, once feared to be lonely and cold, had been transformed by the gentle acts of a man who had chosen to provide support without expectation, only respect and compassion. One afternoon, Margaret asked Thomas to sit by her bedside while she spoke. "I want you to know," she said, her voice soft, "that your kindness has changed everything. I came here expecting solitude, but you have given me warmth, dignity, and the comfort of human connection. You have reminded me that even at the end, life can hold moments of beauty and care." Thomas held her hand, his eyes steady. "It is not extraordinary," he said simply. "It is what anyone should do if they can. I am glad I could help." Margaret smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting both the wisdom of a long life and the peace she had found in these final days. The snow fell gently outside the window, covering the plains in white. Yet inside the room, warmth, light, and quiet companionship created a world entirely different from the harshness beyond the walls. As evening approached, Margaret's breathing grew slower and her body grew weaker. Thomas adjusted her pillows, brought a warm blanket over her, and stayed at her side, quietly offering comfort and reassurance. She closed her eyes, feeling safe in a way she had not known in decades. The room, once filled with uncertainty and fear, was now a sanctuary of care, warmth, and human kindness. In the final hours, Margaret rested peacefully, her hand in Thomas's, her spirit at ease. The harsh frontier outside remained, wild and untamed, yet inside, she experienced the profound comfort of being seen, valued, and cared for. Thomas had given her not only physical comfort but emotional security, allowing her to face the end of her life with dignity and peace. When Margaret passed quietly, Thomas remained at her side, ensuring she was comfortable until her final breath. Her passing was gentle, surrounded by warmth, care, and respect. The town of Willow Creek was stunned when the news spread, not only by her death, but by the story of the rancher who had cared for her with such quiet dedication. People reflected on his actions, realizing that his courage and humanity had transformed the final days of a woman who had once faced them alone. Thomas arranged for Margaret's burial with the same care and respect he had shown during her final days. He ensured she received a proper resting place in the town cemetery, marking her grave with dignity. The townspeople, inspired by the story, learned a lesson about compassion, care, and the quiet heroism that exists in small acts of kindness. Thomas returned to his ranch, continuing his work with the land, but the story of his devotion to Margaret remained in the hearts of those who knew it. Margaret's final days had been transformed not by fortune, but by the quiet presence of someone who chose to care without expectation. Thomas's patience, understanding, and respect had provided her with warmth, companionship, and dignity until the very end. The frontier, often harsh and unforgiving, had witnessed a profound act of humanity, a reminder that even in the most difficult circumstances, kindness and connection could create lasting impact. In the quiet of the ranch house, with the plains stretching endlessly outside, Thomas reflected on the days spent with Margaret. He had not sought recognition, nor had he expected reward. Yet the depth of their connection, the trust and comfort they had shared, had changed them both. Margaret's life, once marked by isolation and struggle, had ended with peace, surrounded by warmth and care. The town, witnessing his dedication, learned that true heroism often exists in quiet acts of love, patience, and respect. And so Margaret's story ended not in fear or solitude, but in dignity, comfort, and the profound knowledge that even at the final chapter of life, human connection could bring peace. The frontier remained vast and wild beyond the walls, but within, her last days were filled with warmth, kindness, and a quiet beauty that would remain in the hearts of all who learned of it. Thomas's actions became a lasting legacy of compassion, a reminder that even in the hardest times, humanity could shine brightest when given freely, quietly, and with respect.